Good evening, and welcome to We the People, brought to you by the League of Women Voters of Minneapolis. My name is Joan Higginbotham, and I'll be your host for this evening's program. Since 1991, every 3 years, Wilder Research has conducted a snapshot of homelessness in Minnesota. Throughout the state, they've interviewed people and talked to people at shelters to see how many people are homeless on that one night during the year. And as I said, that happens every 3 years. The last survey was done in October of 2012. And tonight we have with us Greg Owen, who is a senior research manager at Wilder Research. And Greg is going to talk to us a little bit about the results, what it means as far as homelessness in our state, and perhaps some suggestions for what might be happening in the future. Well, Greg, welcome back. Now, you've been here a couple of times. 3 years ago was the last time.
Thanks for having me on, Joe.
Well, it's interesting to me just to sort of find out how do you do this? I mean, this is the whole state of Minnesota?
The study started originally in 1984 when we did our first survey in St. Paul. And after we conducted about 70 interviews with homeless adults in St. Paul, we were asked to do this again. And in 1986 and then in 1989, we did it for the metro area as a whole. But by 1990, Commissioner Jim Solem, who was the Housing Finance Commissioner at the time, was getting a little frustrated with the lack of information that we had to be able to really plan around services for homeless adults or near homeless adults and children and families. So he asked, could we do this as a statewide project, which threw the fear of God into us, frankly.
Yes.
But we figured out a way to do training. We started doing training by satellite television. We'd be in studios like this doing training for interviewers, because one of the unique features of the study is the fact that we are the only study in the country that uses all volunteer interviewers to go out and collect our information. And so we started with a few hundred interviewers when we did it the first time. In the 2012 study that you just referenced, we had 1,299 interviewers going to 390 locations around the state to interview homeless adults and youth who are on their own. And homeless parents were able to report on the children who were with them at the time.
This was one night. Everybody did this on the same night.
Yeah, that's, I think, one of the other remarkable challenges about this is the logistical challenge of trying to match up 1,299 interviewers with these 390 locations, get them the right materials, the right training materials, get them the right assignment information, know who their site leaders are, and then get to that site. Get the courage up sometimes to go to the site, because sometimes, they're going to downtown Minneapolis sites. We've got suburban church folks that are coming in and screwing up their courage. They're going into shelters. And I think for every single one of them, it's a unique experience. And for many, it's even a life-changing experience to find out that the face of homelessness is really not that far distant from their own.
I can imagine that would be the case. It does seem like a daunting task to get everybody gathered. And the weather, it was October 25th or 26th?
This year, it's always the third Thursday in October. And this year, when we conducted the survey, we had reasonably decent weather. It was getting colder, but we try to do it kind of in the shoulder season, and we've actually done it at that time period every single time in our statewide cycle. So 91, 94, 97, 2000, 2003, 2006, 2009, and our 8th cycle was 2012.
So that would make it more accurate, because there might be fewer or more people depending upon the weather.
It gives us a little bit more confidence that the year-to-year comparisons that we're able to do are reasonable to compare over this period.
Now, as I understand from looking at the survey, you go to shelters, but you also go like under bridges too. You don't just go to places where people are.
That's right.
Supposed to be, so to speak.
I think when we first started the study, we weren't so good at going in locations that were not meant for habitation, such as an encampment or under a bridge, or in a squat, or in a vacant building. Now we've gotten so that we are so well connected with all of the range of service providers. We draw up detailed plans before we go out on this October night and identify all of the locations we want to go to. And in about 40 communities, we have street outreach folks that are specifically trained to go out and do that street outreach. And so we actually write a plan for each continuum of care region in the state of Minnesota so that we are sure that we are getting to at least the main locations. We're not claiming that we find every single person, but we do claim to be probably the most exhaustive survey of its type in the United States.
And so how many people do you think you surveyed this year?
Well, I can tell you we surveyed just over 6,000 people. We interviewed, face-to-face interviews. But
face-to-face?
These are face-to-face interviews. Each volunteer paired up with an individual at a shelter site or a transitional housing program. We use the federal definition of homelessness.
That's what I was going to ask you. What is the definition?
Well, the first part is kind of easy. It's any person without a fixed, regular nighttime residence. And so that would include a battered women's shelter, a transitional housing program, which is time limited, or an emergency shelter. It doesn't include the new form of permanent supportive housing, which we can talk about later, which is one of the most important housing solutions, especially for parts of the population with really serious, significant health-related impairments. But in addition, the definition includes people that are doubled up if they've had multiple residences over time, if they have a child with them, and if they have a barrier to employment. So it's a fairly difficult definition to fit into a survey like ours. So that's why we use a variety of community outreach events. We use events like Homeless Connect and others so that we can actually identify individuals at that site who fit the definition and then conduct the interviews.
Now, they have to be, that's the definition of homeless, but what if somebody's like couch surfing or sleeping in their car or something?
Couch surfing is also included in the definition. One of the most difficult parts of the population to survey, and probably where we have the most concern about being able to report exactly what's going on, is in homeless youth.
Yeah.
That population, first of all, there aren't too many shelters. We have some transitional housing programs that have been developed, but in all, not much more than 100 or so beds in the state for for youth. Now, if they're 18 or older, they can stay in adult shelters, and our definition of youth goes up to age 21 because of the state programs that are appropriate for those youth. But if you're talking about minors, and we've interviewed children as young as 7 or 8 years old who are on their own.
Oh my gosh!
And when we find youth like that, they're typically in some type of a shelter situation, and we conduct the interviews. It takes about 30 minutes to conduct a face-to-face interview, whether it's an adult or a youth. And in that time, we go over almost 300 or so questions. It's an extensive survey, and then we bring that information back. We analyze the data, and actually right now, the study was conducted October 2012. Right now, we'll be cranking out reports related to this data. Our website, and it'll be shown at the end of this program, our website has a wealth of information. Most people don't know all of the information that's available there, but we have the answers to every question in the survey, sliced and diced by whether the type of shelter a person was, the gender of the person, and the region of the state. And so all of that information is available free to anyone that goes onto our website.
Well, I've already got quite a lot of stuff just from my little perusal of it. So it is really, well, so let's talk a little bit about the person that you talk to. What is the average? I mean, is there a typical homeless person?
Well, there's two ways to answer that question.
Yes and no, probably.
Right. I don't think it's not really helpful when you're trying to plan for how to serve individuals who are homeless to think about kind of a typical person. We have almost an equal distribution of men and women, slightly more men, single men in the population than single women. In the last count, just to get some numbers on the table, the last survey found 10,250 plus, just a few over that we were able to identify that were homeless on that night. Now, that's not an estimate, that's an actual count.
Real people.
We interviewed a little over half of the population, but we were able to also account for all of the children that were with parents, and then also identify people that were not interviewed in some shelter sites. We take those census counts, and that's what makes up the 10,250
Oh,
number.
I see. So that you do count everybody who's in the shelter, but you may only interview a number of them.
50 or 60%, sometimes 70 or 80% in the smaller shelters. We try to interview everyone that's available. So in some ways it's a convenient sample, but it's almost an exhaustive convenient sample for us to go and identify the individuals that are there.
Now, I noticed, as I looked at the data, that with the economic crunch came in 2008, was it?
2007-8 was the recession.
But the numbers from 2006 to 2009 it was just exploded.
Yeah, you're pointing out a really important fact, Joan, and that is that from 2006 to 2009, we had about a 25% increase in homelessness.
That was really a shock.
And it was disappointing, I know, to a lot of the people. There are a lot of excellent service providers. We have a lot of effort and resources that are working to create new permanent supportive housing solutions, create some opportunities for subsidized housing. But the recession was really too much. It overwhelmed. And for those that are really at the margins of society, those are the people that feel it hardest and soonest, and for whom it lasts the longest.
Well, 3 years. There was a large percentage of people who've been homeless now for 3 years.
There were, one of the reports that we do is the calculation of the number of persons that have been homeless for a year or longer, or have had multiple episodes of homelessness. That figure is over half of the population. So when you think, and even for family homelessness, we have children in our state who are homeless with one or two parents, most often one parent, but in this latest survey, we had a 22% increase in two-parent households with children who were homeless on the night of our survey.
And now the other question about that is how many of those parents were working?
Work is another thing. Let's go back to that whole 2000 to 2012 line. From 2000 to 2006, we actually began to see a leveling off. We saw some drop in the number of children who were homeless.
So it got better.
Yes, but when that recession hit, we lost some of that advantage we had gained. And so the numbers of homeless children went up. In the 2012 study, we found 3,500 children who were homeless on that night. That number, where we saw the growth, so from 2006 to 2009, we had about a 25% growth. We only had a 6% growth from 2009 to 2012. And I think had we not been as active in the service community, had not had as many programs, we would have seen an even greater increase. But from that period, 2000...
So things got better.
Things did get better.
And we still really aren't, I would say we're still suffering from the recession right now.
We are, and I would say those that are homeless today, they are suffering even more from the recession. The remnants of the recession linger on much longer for people that are at margin, that have less education, that have less opportunity for employment, or less recent employment history. So the numbers that we found that were actually employed, we had a bump from only 6% who were full-time employees in 2009 to 8%, so a little bit of an increase.
Got a little bit better.
A jump from about 20% to 24% who were at least part-time employed. So roughly a quarter of the population have at least part-time employment. But one of the important things that happened in the 2012 legislative session was the fact that 2013 we actually kept the emergency assistance grants. We were at risk of losing those grants, and we added $33 million to housing resources. We didn't get the $50 million bonding that we were hoping for creating new affordable housing, but we did strengthen services that come out of the Minnesota Housing and the Minnesota Department of Human Services. So those were gains for us.
So that is a positive sign, and the people are sort of aware that we have to do more than we've done.
I think so. And then the Homeless Youth Act, which also was passed, where we also saw an infusion of money to really the most vulnerable population. One thing I think that viewers don't understand about homeless youth, I think for some, if a kid on the street and tattoos and piercings, and you think, well, this kid obviously he's been kicked out of his house or he's misbehaved and he's left home. well over half of the children that we interview have been physically or sexually abused. Many of them have had episodes of violence while homeless, and are escaping home situations in some circumstances that are truly unsafe. And one of the factors that contributes to that is what I would call the shredding of the safety net that we've had over the last couple of decades. We have lost a lot of ground in our safety net. I think we restored some in this latest legislative session in Minnesota, but we have lost some ground.
What do you consider the safety net?
Well, the safety net, a couple of really important areas of service. The foster care system, what kind of attention we are able to provide to those kids aging out of foster care, what kind of follow-along we can
And
provide
you
to them.
considered the 18 to 21-year-olds as youth,
Well, they are, and especially
even though
if
they've aged out of foster care.
they have aged out of foster care, but they're still eligible for some of the services that our counties and the state provides. One of the other areas that's an important support and service is MFIP, the Minnesota Family Investment Program, which is Minnesota's family
Now, that used to
welfare.
be a very strong program, but that has sort of declined over the years, too. It's not quite as robust as it was.
No, it's not as robust as it was. There are limits, but some of the MFIP benefits and supports were restored or added to in the latest legislative session. Another one that I'd point out is the child protection system, the resources that go into our child protection system. In child protection, that's oftentimes the first place to intercept episodes of abuse and neglect.
So some child might not have, if child protection doesn't come in, they are on their own.
There are kids that are in situations that are unsafe for them, and I'm not disparaging child protection workers. I think folks in our state do a great job, but the level of resources that we have to support these and other safety net systems, I think we need to address if we're going to. It's not so much about taking people out of homelessness and putting them in housing. It's equally attention to where people become homeless in the first place. What are the circumstances that create opportunities for homelessness? And if you don't have opportunities for children to gain education, and if you don't have opportunities to strengthen the resources for the kids that really have the least access to resources now, then you create conditions where kids will not achieve academically, where they'll have significant barriers against them by the time they get to be adults. And if they've been in the juvenile correction system, if they've been in the child protection system, they're going to have a significant range of risk related to homelessness.
Now, the statistics that I saw in your report were that many of these people, whatever their age, had many diagnoses. They had mental health concerns, they had physical health concerns, they had chemical dependency. I mean, it seems like I wonder, is it a cause or an effect? I mean, if somebody's homeless for a long period of time, it can make a lot of things go wrong.
I think you asked a very difficult question. One of the things, of course, it's very difficult to do in a cross-sectional survey like we do is to try to determine cause and effect. We do know from at least one of our previous surveys where we did specifically the question around alcohol and drug use and around mental health problems, we know that a lot of these conditions exist prior to homelessness. One of the problems that we had no clue about was traumatic brain injury. Now, one would expect, and we had a significant number of Iraq and Afghanistan vets who are homeless in this, but one would expect that maybe in that group you would see traumatic brain injury as a result of war. But we found in the general population of homeless adults, about 30% had symptoms that, I mean, we weren't doing diagnoses in these, but in a series of 4 or 5 questions, we're able to determine that those people have symptoms that make it very likely that they have a traumatic brain injury. And so traumatic brain injury, mental health issues, we still have mental health problems with approximately half of the homeless population. And again, if you go back to the root, if you think about, the Community Mental Health Act in the 70s, emptying out, trying to make more humane our system of services for mentally ill people, one of the things that we did not plan very well for is the fact that many of those people would need housing. And if they were not going to be living with family members, or if they had burned bridges with family members, or family members had been burnt out from trying to provide care and support, if we don't have solutions, we will see those folks in our homeless population.
Well, and of course that leads to the other sort of question that follows. Some of these people are very hard to work with. And so, they get kicked out of their supportive housing or something because not through no fault of their own, they just are hard to work with.
I'll tell you one story, Joan, and I think this it illustrates just what a difficult situation sometimes people face. One of our smaller housing programs in the state that was operated by a church came to me and asked me if I would help them evaluate their programs and services. And so we met, and it was right before Christmas several years back. And the pastor of the church was just heartsick because he had come to the conclusion that the only way to make his program safe for the residents who were there would be to evict one of the residents who was there, who was causing some significant difficulties. And it just bore down on his heart that here he was in the few days before Christmas about to put someone out on the streets from housing. And so I think those kind of dilemmas come up a lot. As much sometimes as you would like to be able to serve and support everyone, sometimes either people's behavior or sometimes the safety concerns that their presence raises for others makes it necessary to restrict some people from shelters.
Now, sometimes I've heard people say that some people said, well, I don't want to go to the shelter because I feel I'm more unsafe there than I am living under a bridge. Is that a real concern?
We did ask people in one of our previous surveys, not in the 2012 survey, but we've tried and used questions throughout this time period, changing up some of the questions. And one was about safety. And one thing that I thought was quite remarkable was that 90% of the individuals that we talked with said that they felt very safe in the shelter that they were in.
Well, that might be because we've learned some things.
I think we have learned some things. I think still there are some difficult circumstances that are hard to manage when you get to the end of an evening and you're just in a safe waiting area and it's mats on the floor and you've had to expand the shelter because there's no more space, or it's the basement of a church that's just opened because you've had to have expansion space because of the volume of pressure at the door. There are chances for people to misbehave toward others, and when that happens, that compromises their safety. So I certainly wouldn't say that there are no safety concerns to address, but I can say that the programs that are operated in our state by the providers that we have, we're very fortunate to have them.
Now, we talked about ending homelessness like pretty soon. It's not going to happen perhaps, but they're still working on it. How does Minnesota stack up against the rest of the country, and how are we doing? Oops, you just dropped your microphone.
Okay, I'll replace my mic here.
There.
I'm on. So one of the, you've asked a really, it's kind of the $64,000 question. How come we haven't ended homelessness? We've had all these efforts.
Right.
So if you look at Minnesota's plan for ending homelessness, it's called Heading Home Minnesota. We've just brought in Kathy Tenbrook, who is the head of Heading Home Hennepin, to lead the state effort. Laura Cadwell led the state effort prior to her. Both excellent people. Both people that we can really, I think, count on or have the best interests of vulnerable populations in mind. We've invested in a lot of strategy to try and do this. One is to build more supportive housing opportunities. That's particularly helpful for those that have significant and persistent mental illness. And we've been placing people into those opportunities, and we have gotten people out of homelessness.
So supportive housing means that they've got like caseworkers that are available to them? And
yes, it means that it's housing with services of some type. And in supportive housing, quite often, we're addressing a variety of potential problems that an individual might have. But in these kind of group housing situations, there are both more opportunities to live in community, and those communities then become places where people feel safe and their behavior becomes sort of more reasonable.
So that's really what we need, is more of those.
I think, and we have other types. We have single room occupancy programs. We have some terrific programs. There's a program operating in Duluth and in Rochester and St. Cloud by Center City Housing, which is primarily for long-term chronic inebriates. And those programs also have had good luck, and once they get people into housing, regulating, mediating behavior, reducing some of the consumption, but most importantly, reducing the public safety dollars, reducing court dollars, reducing all of the other intervention dollars that we would spend otherwise if people were on the street.
So that does help. And you mentioned that in the whole state of Minnesota there are 100 beds for youth?
Well, I don't want to be...
More or less?
I think it's a little bit more than that, but it's not a lot more. The Homeless Youth Act will create some new housing opportunities and more outreach efforts for youth. So I'd say the jury's not in on what our total resources and assets will be in 2013. But what I would say is, compared to homeless adults, youth have many fewer opportunities for shelter, particularly if they're minors.
What about families? I mean, I know there are women with children.
Families make up a significant proportion of this. There were, in our 2012 study, I mentioned there were 10,250 total people that were homeless in our single night count. 3,500 of those were children.
So that's a third.
A third of the population are children, and of that population, half of those are under 6.
So there are shelters for families.
There are.
But is there supportive housing for them?
Yes, there are supportive housing units for families too, and transitional housing programs, time limited. We still fund transitional, where people can get on their feet, and then if they can obtain housing subsidies or vouchers or employment, they're able to get more longer-term housing. One of the things that we've really lost in the sequester has caused some more difficulties is we've lost some of those Section 8 subsidized housing options.
Well, people are on the list for like over a year, I think it said in your study, to get a Section 8 voucher.
We had over 40% of the population reporting that they had been on a waiting list for a long period of time without an opportunity coming up.
So what is the future?
Well, I think ultimately the future is what is the will of the public with regard to this significant part of the population in dire poverty. Robert Reich, our former Secretary of Labor under Clinton, wrote a book called Aftershock, and in that he pointed out that we have never had such polarization of wealth and income in our country since 1929. And long-timers that are still with us can remember 1929 was not a good year.
Yeah, so there is a lot that we need to do.
There is a lot.
And so you can understand that this survey is so important because it gives us an idea of what we need to work on and what's been done and where we stand. So we'd like to thank Greg Owen from the Wilder Research folks for being here with us tonight. As he said, www.wilderresearch.org, more information than you could ever want. So I hope you'll check that out if you're interested. And thanks to you for tuning in tonight to We the People. This is Joan Higginbotham for the League of Women Voters saying good night and come again.